Building a secure system or ATO'd system for a FedRAMP environment, for example, does require some thought into the process. And today we're going to review some of those things. The building of the architecture, like the network, for example, the servers, the application software, the storage, all of these items are factors when you build out a system design that will go through an ATO process, or in this case, or this example, a FedRAMP process. Remember, it's important to understand that FedRAMP is an ATO, an authority to operate used within the federal government. Although we're using this as an example for FedRAMP, building a secure, repeatable system that can scale properly and stay within those security boundaries is certainly something that applies to any industry within the market today. Building that secure system design or that foundation is very important. And one of the key critical items is the implementation of a non impactful architecture. That means essentially that I can add capacity to my infrastructure without changing the configuration of the component that's being expanded. For example, if I add a network switch, let's say I start my authorization process with a 24 port switch, and now 2 years later, I want to put in a 48 port switch because my environment has doubled in size. I don't want to have to go back through the authorization process or redefine my security controls to add those additional 24 ports, right? To go from a 24 port switch to a 48 port switch. I want the same operating system to reside on the switch, the 24 port and the 48 port switch, so that all I have to do is add capacity. That is what we call a non impactful change, meaning that it does not change the core security value or health or strength of that ATO'd environment or that baseline. So that's non-impactful change. Some great examples would be Arista's network, for example, very consistent across product lines. Aruba's network, their wireless and their infrastructure, very consistent across all their product line with the same operating system. 3PAR storage by HP, very consistent across all platforms. One storage head. It doesn't matter if you start off with 500 disks and go to 50,000 disks, it's the same operating system. So it becomes a non-impactful change. So let's move on into what we call a bill of materials or a BOM. A bill of materials, when designing a secure and repeatable environment, a FedRAMP environment, has to include everything that will impact that environment, the hardware and the software. So all of the hardware, your servers, your storage, your key management servers, your firewalls, IDS, IPS, all of the hardware has to be included inside of your bill of materials. And you have to be able to associate all of those hardware components with one another in an architecture. How does this look for my production architecture? How does this look for my backup architecture? How does this look for my test and dev architecture? How do I have those firewalled off? All of that has to be extremely clear in the system design on the hardware. And then, of course, the software that rides on top of that hardware to execute and to deliver all of the requirements that are defined within the NIST families or controls, right? So things like configuration management, system management, backup, access control, inventory, all of that needs to be included from a hardware and software perspective. Next, you have to include the process that you're going to use to do all of this work. So remediation, systems management, how does your staffing model look from who owns the system? And when I use the word system, it's hardware, software, process, everything you're seeing on the screen here. That's a system, quote unquote system. So who owns that system? How are you going to deal with geo-dispersed environments? In a FedRAMP environment, it has to be geographically dispersed. And so what does data center A look like? Data center B look like in a FedRAMP environment? You're also going to need a 3 PAO to inspect your environment. They create essentially a penetration and a report that's then given to the Joint Authorization Board, the JAB, and to GSA, and that's kind of in a FedRAMP environment. But the 3 PAO really is the guys who are helping you create and validate and make sure all those controls are in good shape. And then the last thing that you really should consider in your system design is how you're going to deliver this service. What accounting program are you going to use? How are you going to onboard new virtual machines and new requirements from users? How are you going to allow them to do self-provisioning or restrict some forms of self-provisioning? How are you going to set the pricing model up? How are you going to resell this service, especially in a FedRAMP environment? The objective is to resell this service to somebody else. All of these things become critical design criteria that are included in the system design that you need to consider before taking the step down the FedRAMP road.